Thanks very much for the kind introduction. Thank you, Francisco and the team, Jim and everyone from DeLaval for the invitation to be here. This is an event that I had circled on my calendar about a year ago already. We had a VMS Pro in Madison, and was it February? Almost exactly a year ago. And Francisco made mention of this event, of the beginnings of this event, and it was something that I looked forward to participating at this time. It's a pleasure to talk on this topic area on improving feed access and consumption, specifically to robotic dairies. And what I'm going to present to you today is a summary of the research that we've been doing over the last 10 years or so, starting with work that I started with doing my Ph.D. a number of years ago at the University of British Columbia in Canada, and then moving on into my faculty position with the University of Guelph. And one of the focuses is particularly looking at how cows eat, and then how we use that information, how we use that knowledge to improve feeding management. And so what we're going to be talking about today is a lot of that research generalized across production systems or types of housing systems, milking systems, and then key in on some specifics related to robotic milking, and hopefully have some really good take-homes for you today. In the spirit of the quizzes that have been going on, I like to start with a lot of questions, or I like to pose a lot of questions to you. And so my first question for you is, what is the problem here? And I'm going to show you a video. And I want you to throw out some things that you see wrong with this scenario when it comes to feeding dairy cows. So what's wrong? Sorting. Okay, good. What else? Too long particles. What else? Feed's too far away. The feed's crap. Anything else? The surface they're eating off of is bad. Okay, good. Excellent. It's interesting to note the first thing someone mentioned is actually the behavior of the cows, right, rather than the feed. To me, in any case, we look at what the cow's doing, and that's good. The feed in this case is bad. And that's something that, fortunately, we know a lot about feeding dairy cows. We know a lot about good feeds. We know a lot about the nutritional requirements of cows, the metabolic demands of cows. We know how to take all that information. We've got good models to be able to model, based on our production targets and goals, how we can put a great ration together and use that information and put it together well. And so we've come a long ways in the dairy industry, and thankfully, those kind of rations that you see there are not commonplace. That was a specific place and time, and I guess one of my first take-homes is that we can do a very good job putting rations together. That was a bad example, but we have the knowledge to put very good rations together. But the question then becomes is, what do we actually get out of that ration then at the end of the day? And that's what I want to really get you to think about today, is how the cow actually gets full value out of that ration that we put in front of her, because that full value isn't always recognized on every farm. And so if we're going to think about optimizing feed bunk management or feeding management on robotic dairy cows, there's three kind of take-homes that I want you to think about this morning. And number one is to ensure cows receive their feed consistently. Number two is we want cows to want to eat their feed, to actually want to go to the bunk, and I think I'll come back to that later, but that's critical, particularly when we think about robotic dairies. Francisco mentioned it earlier. Regardless of cow flow, we need cows up on their feet. We want them moving around. We want them to be going to the bunk. We want them to be going to the robot. And those two things in robotic systems are inherently tied to each other. And then lastly, we want them to eat their feed in a manner which is good for them and as it's put in front of them. And if we can accomplish all these things, we're going to get full value out of that feed that we put in front of cows. And so what I want to do is walk you through why these things are important, and then talk about some practical application of these ideas. So first, why does ration consistency matter? So why does it matter that we provide a consistent ration in front of cows? Dean mentioned it earlier. He said we need to have a consistent ration in front of cows. And I guess first and foremost, when we think about consistency and we think of the dairy cow, we know that cows love consistency. And I think if we've worked with cows long enough, we know this. We know this from a behavioral standpoint. We know this from a physiological standpoint. From a behavioral standpoint, there's nothing that messes up a cow more than messing up her daily routine in something. And we know that if we throw some kind of wrench into her routine, that throws her off for the whole day, and that's going to have a big impact on her. So we know she loves consistency in terms of her behavioral routine. We also know that she loves consistency in terms of what she does with her feed from a digestion standpoint. The rumen, we've heard a little bit about that yesterday as well. The rumen of a cow loves consistency. The more consistent that we can keep that feed that's going into that rumen on a day-to-day basis, the better it's going to be for that cow. That's one of the reasons why we moved away from feeding components and those kind of diets to feeding more TMRs a long time ago, was to make sure that not only can we get cows to eat this whole variety of different feedstuffs, but we can get them to eat in a consistent manner. So we have this nice consistent flow of nutrients into the rumen and be able to keep that rumen working very efficiently and very well. We actually demonstrated this in a study a couple years ago where we went on a bunch of farms in Eastern Ontario, Canada. We actually went on 22 freestall farms. They were parlor milk farms. And we went on these farms for 7 days, both in the summertime and the wintertime. And what we did is we sampled the feed in the bunk of those farms across those 7 days. And then what we got from the producer was a copy of their formulated ration. We compared how well those two matched up, which in the most case didn't match up that well, which tells us a little bit about feeding management there as well. But the other thing that we were really interested in was looking at how consistent the feed was delivered on a day-to-day basis. And so we looked at a number of things, including the nutrient content of the rations that were provided to the cows, as well as the physical structure of those rations. And what you have here is a graph of basically the amount of variability, across 7 days in terms of the energy content. The NEL is the energy content, CV is a measure of variation. And basically all you have to know is that bigger is better in this case. So more variation is worse. So in this case here, when we correlated at a herd level across these 7 days, the amount of variability with dry matter intake at a herd level, we see this negative relationship across those farms. So basically more variability day to day. So basically if that ration and its energy content is doing this on a day-to-day basis, we're seeing lower dry matter intake at a herd level. We didn't measure exactly why this might be happening on these farms and what was causing that variability in that case. But what we do know there is that, again, anything to throw potentially that rumen off just that little bit from day to day in terms of the consistency, what's going into that rumen, might be enough to throw her off, cause some inconsistency in intake patterns, and in this case, we actually see lower intakes as that variability becomes higher. And so what we saw is that across these farms, every half-point increase was about a drop of a kilo or 2.2 pounds in loss in dry matter intake across those farms. And it wasn't just intake, it was milk production as well. And so a little bit more variability. In this variability here, you see it a little bit more scattered. We're still explaining, in this case, we're explaining about 30% of the variability in herd level production based on how variable from day to day the ration was that was getting fed to those cows. So those farms that were doing a better job in terms of getting a more consistent ration tended to have higher milk production than those farms that were much more inconsistent on a day-to-day basis. It wasn't just the ration energy content, it was also the physical structure of the ration. And this is where we actually saw a ton of variation. And so this is just one example. This is the amount of variation in the amount of long particles in that ration. So the stuff that sits on the top of a shaker box, most people have seen a shaker box here. So the stuff that sits on the top screen of a shaker box, we looked at how much variability. And we saw across these farms anywhere from 10 to 30, 35% variability day to day. So these big swings in terms of basically the physical structure of that ration that was given to those cows, which again, we didn't measure the reasons for that, likely because of mixing errors, differences in actually components going into that, mixing times and influencing chop length on the forages, etc. All those things are going to have an influence on that variability. And same thing here again. We see as we get more variability, this tendency for less milk yield at a herd level. Again, not a perfect relationship. You might look at it and say, well, it's a little bit of a scatter plot, but when you draw a tendency line through here and model this, accounting for all the other variability associated with those rations, this is a significant relationship. And we're explaining, again, about 30% of the variability in their milk production here. And so those herds, again, with more variability, were experiencing lower milk yield and at the same time lower feed efficiency. So we saw a reduction in efficiency as these herds basically had more variability in terms of what was actually getting thrown in front of those cows. So our challenge then is to think about, from a feeding management standpoint, making sure that we are consistent day in and day out. And so making sure feed is mixed and delivered the same way each day. And so then we have to start thinking about what are the impediments, what are the steps that, or the check marks that we have in place to prevent that inconsistency from happening. So depending on the feeding system that you're operating with, depending on the number of feeders that you have on the farm, we have to think about, okay, what can we do to ensure that feed is going to be delivered on a consistent basis day in and day out. And so the tools that we have for that, we have to think about. Again, I don't have the answers for you, but I have some ideas about what things we can start looking at, what are things that we can check off in terms of preventing some of these things from happening. So at a basic level, SOPs and training, do we have standard operating procedures for feeding on our farms? Whether or not it's one person, two persons, or 10 people that are feeding cows on a given farm, they all need to be following the same protocol, right? And so those people need to be feeding along the same protocol and be trained to do it the same way. And again, even if it's just one person, does that one person do the same thing day in, day out? If you've got 5 different people doing it different days of the week, are they doing the same thing day in, day out? So we need to think about what training programs do we have, how are we actually following those, and are we actually following up on those things? Are we looking at those things, whether or not people are doing these things consistently? And then as our kind of desire to track these things and monitor these things to a greater extent grows, we can start thinking about other ways of actually looking at this. So employing the use of TMR management programs, things like TMR Watch or TMR Tracker or other systems that allow us to actually track loads on a day-to-day basis. And we can actually use that not only to check that consistency from a day-to-day basis, but also look at the consistency of individual feeders on the farm to make sure that the stuff that's getting delivered, everything that's should be going to the cows is actually getting to the cows on a day-to-day basis. And then I put here lastly, and I'm going to come back to this later when we're going to talk about feed delivery frequency and such, but automated feeding systems. I think this is probably one of the most exciting things that we have in the dairy industry when it comes to feeding is some of the automation that's potentially available to us. And as I'll describe later, automated feeding has huge benefits from a physiological perspective from the cow in terms of the impact that might have on our eating pattern. But the other thing that it does is it takes that human inconsistency out of the equation when we're mixing and delivering feed. So basically, it's going to rely on, again, the feed that's put into the system, but then once it gets there, in theory, again, with an automated system, it should do the same thing day in, day out. And it's going to take that inconsistency out in terms of the amounts of ingredients, the amount of mixing time, how it actually gets delivered to the cows. And so by taking that human inconsistency out, we can do a much better job in terms of getting a very good, consistent feed product in front of our cows across the day. Okay, moving on to the cows then. Let's say we get the feed done well, we get it mixed together well, we get it delivered correctly. The next thing we have to think about, what does the cow actually do with her feed? And we need to think about how the cow actually manipulates that feed and consumes that feed. And so I've spent a good portion of my life, probably the last 12, 13 years of my life, I guess it's not a good portion of my life, it's a small portion so far, but hopefully I'll continue to keep working on that area. But looking at how dairy cows eat and considering why it's important to consider how dairy cows eat. And this isn't, I guess when I first approached looking at feeding behavior of cows, I started looking at kind of the downstream kind of stuff, the impacts that we'll talk about as well. But the most primary reason, the most basic reason why we need to think about how dairy cows eat is the fact that if we're dealing with an animal that's producing milk and our opportunity to increase milk production is primarily through getting that cow to eat more, we need to think about how do we get a cow to eat more? Well, for a cow to eat more, she has to do one thing. She has to change the way she eats. We can put all kinds of different things in front of a cow, but she's not going to eat more unless she changes her eating behavior. And so for a cow to change her level of intake, she has to change some aspect of her feeding behavior. A cow can't just magically suck feed up and absorb it from that bunk. So she has to change some aspect of the way that she consumes her feed. And this is a great schematic that I use just to explain this, because it's basically simple math. If we're thinking about the dry matter intake level of a cow, we think about how much intake a cow is eating. It's basically a function of those other aspects, those aspects of her eating behavior. So if we want a cow to eat more, she either has to have more meals per day or have larger meals, because meal size times meal frequency equals intake, right? Basically, the meals cross off and you get kilograms per day and you get your intake level. Same thing with the time course of eating. If a cow's going to eat more, she has to spend more time feeding or eat faster. Or in either of these cases, some combination of those two factors, right? So they don't have to be mutually exclusive, they can go hand in hand. So for a cow to eat more, again, she's going to have one or more combination of changes in these aspects of her eating behavior. Now from a modeling standpoint, we've often had a very difficult time doing this. So we think this is really easy. We can just measure simply the amount of time a cow spends eating, look at her rate and multiply these things and be able to model this and actually be able to predict something like intake based on her meal patterning or time at the bunk. The problem is there's a lot of variability between cows in terms of not only how much time they spend eating, but there's other factors that are going to influence that, like social factors, et cetera, and things that we're going to talk about. Stripping away a lot of the variability, we've actually had some good success recently actually looking at or trying to model some of these effects. And I just thought I'd share that with you. So this is some data that we put together last year that we're hoping to publish in the coming year, where we actually took a bunch of data sets that we had. So we had a whole bunch of studies that we had done where we had really good behavioral data, so good information on the time course of eating and the meal patterning of cows, their intake levels, their production levels, and we put it all together in this big mathematical model. And what we spit out at the end of the day is the best kind of predictors of things like dry matter intake level. And what you see here in this graph is basically the amount of feeding time of a cow, so how much time that cow is, these cows are spending eating across the day against her dry matter intake level. And each of these dots represents one cow week worth of data. So it's basically 7 days of data per cow averaged across a week. So this is pretty strong data on an individual cow basis, and there's about 144 observations here. And what you see here across all this is this, again, positive relationship. It's not really steep. We have some variability around that line. And again, we're explaining about what we'd say about 35% of the variability in dry matter intake based on our feeding time. And so what this tells us is that, again, and it goes to what we were talking about earlier, if we want to get more intake in cows, we've got to get cows spending more time at the bunk. And so what we saw here is that basically every minute, or let's say 10 minutes of extra feed time at the bunk was the equivalent of about 200 grams or half a pound of dry matter intake per day. And one of the other associations that we saw was with meal frequency as well. And so more meals, basically every extra meal per day was associated with that extra 200 grams or half a pound of dry matter intake per day. And the reason I highlight those two things is because we're going to talk about the impact that those have on rumen health as well. And so in our model, it wasn't feeding rate. As I told you, it's that rate times the time equals intake, and it's meal frequency by meal size, which equals dry matter intake. But it was really the time which the cow was spending eating, as well as the number of meals, and conversely the size of those meals, so actually smaller meals, being more positively related to total dry matter intake in these cows. So related to that, the other thing that we need to consider is not only when cows are eating and how much time they're spending eating and how they distribute their meals across these days, but we also need to think about how the cow actually consumes that feed and the impact that that has on the digestive process of that cow. And two things in particular that we need to think about is how the feed's consumed and what the cow actually gets out of it at the end of the day. And so I want to walk you through why these two things are important for us to consider. So first and foremost, how is feed consumed? And when I think about how feed is consumed by a cow, I like to look at what a cow is and what she's designed to do. And we heard yesterday, and that was great, because we heard about situations like we often, in our North American dairy culture, we get locked into this idea that basically the only way to feed cows is to feed them a TMR in a bunk. And we heard very successful dairies feeding cows on pasture with supplementation. There's a lot of cows that are kept around the world still that are on pasture with no supplementation at all and producing milk. And when we think about what a dairy cow is designed to do from an eating standpoint, the dairy cow is designed as a grazing animal, and it's designed to be grazing on pasture. Now, we've modified that, we've changed the way we feed cows, but it's good to think about the differences and think about the implication that that eating behavior or those differences in eating behavior have on that cow and what she actually does with that feed. And so what I like to do, and I have a couple of videos playing here. One is a cow grazing. Again, don't get caught up on the quality of the pasture. And then on the right side there, you've got a cow eating a TMR. But I want you to think about, oh, it's supposed to keep looping. It's not doing that. Let's see if we can get it to go again. Think about what's different. Look at the mouths of these two cows. What's different when you look at these two situations? You look at a grazing cow versus a cow that's eating TMR in that bunk. What's different? So what's a grazing cow doing? She's working harder. What's she doing with her mouth? She's opening it. She's taking little bites, right? She's going to take a series of bites. She'll stop. She'll manipulate it a bit. She'll chew it and swallow it and keep on going. She'll probably spend how many hours a day? Grazing guys here. How many hours a day does a cow spend grazing? 6. And that's for a supplemented cow. If that cow had only pasture to graze, wasn't going to have any supplementation, how many hours? 8, 9, 10 potentially, yeah. Okay, it's going to be distributed across the day. This cow here, consuming feed out of a bunk. Sorry, it disappeared again there. How much time a day does she spend at the bunk? 5 to 6. Now, she might spend 5 to 6 hours a day, probably only 3 to 4, maybe 5 hours actually eating feed, right? In this case here, she's going to probably eat, in my guess, would be almost twice as much dry matter in probably about half the time, or a third of the time even. And so that differential, that difference in terms of that eating behavior is going to have an impact on how that cow actually digests that food. In this case, if you get this cow eating, again, twice as much in about a third the amount of time, think about the difference too. What's in that feed? Well, it's about half forage and the other half is what? Concentrate, right? Highly fermentable stuff that's going to get digested much quicker. And so we know that the eating pattern of this cow here in that barn is going to have an impact, particularly on the rumen function. Now, both cases are for sure, but even more so for that cow that's fed a TMR or a PMR. And so we know that, and we've long known this, that when cows are forced to eat very few, very large meals, particularly TMR, highly concentrated feeds, concentrate itself, we know that cows run the risk of what we call subacute ruminal acidosis. So cows slug feeding, having big, large meals of grain. What happens is that grain gets digested first. It's the fiber that takes a long time, so the grain gets digested first, causes a big drop in rumen pH, and then slowly comes up. And you see this real cyclical pattern in terms of the digestion of the cow. And again, if we're thinking of consistency, it creates inconsistency in that rumen environment in terms of what's going on in the rumen of that cow. Alternatively, if we get cows to slow down the rate of intake, have longer feeding times, slower rate of intake, you get cows spending more time chewing while eating. They actually have more saliva flow. Saliva is good for rumen buffering, keeps the rumen more stable. By getting cows to have more meals, smaller meals across the day, you actually end up with a more stable rumen environment. And so less inconsistency, more stable. And what that means is you actually get better digestion in the rumen, more efficient digestion, particularly of fiber. So fiber digestion becomes more efficient. And at the end of the day, you avoid those depressions in rumen pH. And it's those depressions in rumen pH which actually cause or are a contributor to milk fat depression in cows. And so we're going to reduce the risk of experiencing low milk fat by avoiding those big drops in rumen pH. And again, when we try model this, when we try look at this at an individual cow basis, we actually see some of these effects coming out. And so this is data from a study from one of ours from a couple years ago, where I simply took the cows that were in the study and correlated their meal frequency and their milk fat content. And again, what you see here is this positive relationship where basically the cows that have more meals per day tend to have slightly higher milk fat content. Again, it's not a massively steep line. It's kind of a nice incline there. But what you see here is that those cows having more meals, smaller meals distributed across the day, those cows are more likely to have milk of higher fat content. Again, because of that rumen stabilizing effect of having more meals across the day. Similarly, this isn't only just milk fat, but in this data set, we actually see the same relationship with fat-corrected milk yield. And so in this case here, very similar type slope here, where we see that those cows with, and these are pretty good production cows, or a number of them, we see those cows with the highest meal frequency tend to have the highest production of these cows in this data set. And again, I realize the limitation. You see quite a bit of variability here, some differences between cows. This is not a ton of cows in this case. So what we actually did, similar to what I showed you before, in our larger data set, is to look at this with a larger sample of cows, a larger number of studies altogether. And that's what you see here. And again, some of you might look at this and go, okay, it looks like a little bit of a shotgun blast, right? I don't really see that. But the line that you see there, the black line, is the actual statistical model that we can generate from this when we account for variability between cows in terms of days in milk, lactation number, different diets that were fed in different studies. And what we see here is this positive trend line again, where those cows that have basically the highest meal frequency tend to be our highest producing cows as well. And this is fat-corrected milk, and that's a really interesting thing there, is that it tends to be the fat-corrected milk which is the most consistently associated, because again, I think of that rumen stabilizing effect. It's not only the meals driving intake and the meals driving intake which drives production, but it's meals driving a more consistent rumen as well. And so we're seeing that fat effect there as well. And so a positive impact not only on fat production, but total milk production as a whole. The other aspect, and this goes back to the first video that I showed you already this morning, was we also need to know what the cow consumes. And someone picked up on that first video, that cow was sorting, right? And again, in this video here, we see a cow sorting. So why do cows sort their feed? They look for grain. They like to swallow, not chew. So they actually, and that's an interesting point. So they'll actually prefer to eat things that they can eat faster. And we've shown that actually. So going back to that other video I showed you, she was taking her tongue and just lapping it in. So the easier something is to eat, the quicker they can eat it, they actually prefer to do that. So they'll actually select for the smaller particles to actually increase the rate of intake in some cases. Often they're eating the small stuff, they're eating the stuff that they want to eat. They're going to avoid forage. Sometimes they'll select for forage. What does that tell us? The forage is tasty, could be. Generally though, unless the concentrate that's in the ration is really bad, they're going to select for the concentrate over the forage, unless, again, you've got a situation where you've got an upset rumen where they're actually going to be selecting for fiber, selecting for effective fiber in that case. Cows sort because they can and they want to, really, right? I always use the analogy. We had a nice taco lunch yesterday. If we took all those ingredients and threw them in a big pile, would we just take a scoop of that and throw it on our plate and be happy with it? Probably not, right? We'd still pick out the stuff that we want. And the cow eating a TMR is no different than that. The cow's going to pick out the stuff that she wants to eat from that TMR. What that does is, I guess, two things. Number one is typically cows select against fiber. So again, cows are not consuming sufficient effective fiber. So to keep that rumen, again, healthy and consistent. And then number two, it creates inconsistency in terms of what she consumes relative to what we expect her to consume. So we put all this time and effort into building good rations for cows. We say, this is how much you got to put into this is how much you got to put into that. And it's on paper there, gets mixed up right, and gets put in front of the cows. And when we model this, when we look at this on an individual cow basis, we see that cows will select anywhere from probably 5 to 10% variance from what we expect them to eat. So in a lot of cases, cows are eating 5 to 10%, if given the opportunity, 5 to 10% more short stuff, high energy stuff, less fiber than what we predict. And so our models, all these things, all this information that we've put into putting together good rations basically gets thrown out of the window by the cow, because she's saying kind of, to heck with that, I'm going to do what I want to do with that feed, and I'm going to consume what I want. And then it doesn't surprise us at the end of the day if, say, things like our production targets aren't met based on the rations that we're putting in front of cows. One of the things that I often ask producers is whether or not they see sorting in their cows. And some producers are very honest, say, yeah, we see sorting. Other producers say, well, at the end of the day, basically, whatever's left for the refusals or orts, there's just a little bit left. I don't see much sorting, so my cows don't sort. Is that the case? Even if the leftovers, even if you have leftovers that exactly mimic the stuff that was delivered to the cows at the beginning of the day, does that mean that cows didn't sort? No, not necessarily, right? Cows that get to the bunk, what's the first thing that cows do when they get to the bunk? They smell the feed, and they do what? They dig a hole. There's two reasons why they dig a hole. One is to sort, basically, right? They dig that hole, she gets down to the ground there, so she can push stuff around and she can start lapping up the stuff that she wants. And number two, does a cow want to be eating at face level? No. Again, think of that grazing cow. What's the most natural position for a cow to eat? Head down, right? Cows don't like, you've got 3-4 feet of feed in front of a feed bunk. Cow doesn't go in and just start taking bites out of that pile. That's not a natural eating behavior or eating pose for a cow. Cow likes to actually be head down. So that's one of the other reasons she'll push that pile away. She'll get right down to the ground and actually start eating it from that perspective. And then nicely and conveniently, when they're able to do that, they're able to get down to the ground, they're able to push it around and get the stuff out that they want. From a production standpoint, we know that this has impacts. One of the most consistent things that we've seen in research, and I've got 3 studies here that we've published, I didn't have time to show you the data, but basically in all these studies where we've modeled at, again, an individual cow basis, we've looked at how much sorting cows do, we find this nice relationship with milk fat percentage. Cows that do more sorting tend to have lower milk fat. And again, inconsistency in fiber intake, more inconsistency in the ruminant environment, and you get lower milk fat production. So these are things to think about when troubleshooting these kind of things on farm. We see sorting. We've got an issue with milk fat on the farm. Yes, it might be a ration thing, but actually looking at what the cows are actually doing with the feed can tell us a lot as well in that scenario. Another aspect of sorting, and this goes back to kind of thinking about it from a group level, is that sorting doesn't just individually affect one cow. It affects the group as a whole when we're thinking about it from a group perspective. And so this is data here on the bottom of just how fiber content, so NDF is fiber, measure of fiber in the feed, how NDF content changes across the day as cows sort their feed. So as they're sorting against fiber, they're leaving more fiber in the bunk. What you see is this nice curvilinear increase in the amount of fiber in the bunk across the day. And so what that means is that as the cows sort, and as they go to the bunk at different time periods of the day, they end up starting to consume a different ration. So not only are you creating inconsistency within that cow in terms of what she's consuming, but you're creating inconsistencies between cows depending on when they go to the bunk. So if a cow goes to the bunk here, she eats a ration that looks like this. She goes here, it looks like this, and later in the day it looks like this. So we're creating, again, more inconsistency in terms of what actually gets consumed by those cows. And then when we think about it, or when we've looked at this at a herd level, we see that inconsistency translating into production differences. And so this is data from that same study I showed you earlier where we actually looked at the consistency in the ration. A number of other things that we looked at in that study were things like the amount of sorting that was occurring on these herds. Simply, again, by comparing how much was given to the cows or what was given to the cows and what the cows refused at the end of the day. And we saw that across herds, basically every 2% refusal of long particles, so again, the stuff that sits on the top of a shaker box, every 2% refusal of that was associated with about 2 pounds or 0.9 kilos of fat-corrected milk loss and about a 2% decrease in production efficiency. And the range that we had in our herds was anywhere from about 0 to 10% refusal of long particles. So some herds basically not seeing much in terms of sorting at all, with other herds, again, 10% variation really in what those cows were consuming. And so we're seeing about, again in that case, that's every 2%, so probably about a 10-pound difference in milk production between herds with a lot of sorting versus not sorting at all. Just basically the variation in milk production we're able to explain based on what the cows are actually doing with their feed. And so again, when you talk to a nutritionist, can a nutritionist make 10 pounds of milk magically appear by changing something in the ration, right? Adding some kind of additive? Very difficult to do that. We can eliminate sorting, we can gain those 10 pounds differences. That's what the field data tells us, that we're able to gain that kind of difference in production simply by getting cows to eat more consistently. Okay, next step then is how do we actually use this knowledge? What are we gonna do with this knowledge now? We know how cows should eat, we know what they should eat. The next question is, how do we actually put this into practice? How do we make sure that cows get full value out of the feed that we provide to them? Is this the way? What's the problem here? There's no feed. Good. How many times do you walk on a dairy farm and there's some group of cows without feed? Often. When you go to the dairyman and you ask them about that group of cows, what is their response? We're just getting ready to feed, or, well, that's unusual. They're not, right? They had lots of feed yesterday, or some other excuse, right? And someone said, and I don't like to call dairy farmers liars. Someone said yesterday dairy farmers are liars. I forget who that was. They're just busy. It's true, right? So often we don't realize these things, right? But the reality is that almost every time that I walk onto a farm, I find at least one bunk that doesn't have sufficient feed in it. And again, I'm not being accusatory to producers here, but those are the little things that we need to be on top of in terms of making sure that if we're going to maximize intake, if we want cows to maximize their intake, particularly thinking about Dr. Nordland's talk yesterday, our transition cows being probably first and foremost on our minds, we got to make sure that those cows actually have feed in front of them and can actually eat something rather than walking to a bunk that's empty. What about this situation? Oh.
I'm from Minnesota, and there's a lot of people our way that feed to an empty bunk. I mean, there's some nutritionists that are pushing that, and some are having success. Do you have any answers?
Good question. So the question is feeding to an empty bunk, something that I didn't include in this presentation. Very good question. I was just working on a book chapter where we're writing about feeding management, and that was one of the sections I talked about is feeding amounts and going to zero refusal or slick bunk scenarios. And I have no problem with that as long as basically the cows run out within, say, a half an hour of the next feed delivery. The challenge is to make that operational, to do that well on a dairy farm is near impossible. Because one day they're going to run out a half an hour before, the next day they'll run out 2 hours before, the next day they might not run out, and so then the feed gets adjusted again, and then they get less the next day, and then suddenly they run out, the cows eat more aggressively. And so actually in those cases, what you see in those herds, and we don't have a lot of really good data on that, but what I tend to see from an anecdotal standpoint is a lot more variability, again, like in terms of what the cows are actually consuming on a day-to-day basis. So you see much more cyclical intakes in cows that are fed to slick bunks. Because the people that are feeding those cows, the people that are reading the bunks, unless they're doing a super job and really bang on every day making sure that there's the exact amount of feed available to those cows and getting those cows to run out just at the right time, you're going to end up with that cyclical nature. What the cows do, and this is where we actually have some good data on, is what you see is the cows then start to adapt their eating behavior in association with that. So we actually see, going back to some of the things we talked about, we actually start to see more cyclical intake patterns as well as changes in the way they eat. So they tend to start having larger meals, eating faster. They realize that there's certain times of the day when that's when they're going to have access to the feed. They actually compete more There's been some studies that show that as well. They actually compete more for feed access. So my thing, or my take home is that whether or not you're feeding to a slick bunk or you're cleaning up that bunk with 3% refusals or whatever your target is, that you're minimizing the amount of time that that bunk is empty per day. It kind of goes back to that calf. We've often heard this mantra that we need to make animals eat aggressively, and one of the ways to do that is to actually have them hungry for a time period and then get them to, so quote unquote, attack the bunk, right, and eat feed. But in those situations, you're not only potentially causing basically bad eating patterns in those cows, but you're running the risk of some cows just not eating enough and not getting to feed when they want to. And so that'd be I guess my recommendation is that why we need to be careful in those situations not to have bunks that go empty for too long. This situation. Feed needs to get pushed back. So this cow here, what's she going to do? What is she going to do? Yeah, she's looking at me going, okay, when are you going to push this feed in, right? She doesn't want to eat this stuff here. She wants to eat this stuff. She's going to make the choice here in this case of either going to lie down or she's going to wait and stand there unproductively until that feed actually gets pushed back to her. And again, when we're thinking about this from a robotic scenario, going back to the last slide, same thing with this one, what you end up having here is unmotivated cows. If there's not feed available for them, or if the feed that's available to them is the stuff that they don't want, those cows aren't going to be stimulated to get up and go to the bunk, and they're not going to be moving. They're going to be less likely to want to milk at the same time. Pardon? Say, good question. So this neck rail, this is basically a post rail with a swing bar on it. I don't particularly like these neck rails, especially when you've got one cow at the bunk. It puts a lot of weight on the cow in terms of how much pressure they have to put on their neck. I'll say it now, and again, this is something I was thinking about when I was writing my book chapter the other day. I was thinking about how we evaluate actually bunk design and neck rails, headlocks, and these kind of things. And my take home is that you can build a neck rail for any height, basically, and it can be not problematic for cows, as long as there's feed available for those cows, right? So you can have this neck rail up here, you could have this neck rail down here. As long as the cow can get her head down and there's feed available to her, it's not a problem where that neck rail is, or if it's offset or not. By looking at the necks of the cows, that's probably the easiest way to tell you if you've got good feed bunk management in terms of feed accessibility on a farm. If we look at the necks of cows and you see hair loss, you see scabbing, you see swelling, basically the more and more of you see that, the more you realize that you've got a problem, not only with the position potentially of that neck rail, but the availability of feed for those cows, because that tells you that the cows are pushing on something, they're pushing on that neck rail, and they're trying to gain access to the feed that's in the bunk there.
Hey, Trevor?
Yep.
What's your opinion on J-bunk, and why did it go away? We don't see much in the field anymore. It kind of takes away our issue with push.
Yeah. Another good question. So my opinion on J-bunk, actually, I've seen barns where it works very well. And again, yeah, feed doesn't have to be pushed up. It's there. Again, with the wall there, it's harder for the cows to toss often. So we have less feed wastage in some of those situations. Why did it go away? Labor and cleanup, right? Again, where I've seen it work really well, Jack's got experience with this with, say, the outside feeding systems in Finland, where they played around with this, is where you've got a fixed feed bunk with a wall on there. It works well, but you have to then manage, it goes back to managing your refusal levels. You basically have to manage for a very close to 0% refusal in those cases. Because if you don't, you have to clean it up. And if it's difficult to clean out, people don't do it. And that causes more problems, and those things just compound on top of each other. If you can design, I've seen barns where they design nice bunks that are very square, where they can either, if it's not a very big barn, they can just run a shovel down there and pick up the refusals very easily, or they can push them out with some kind of device very easily. I think they can work very well. But it comes down to how people want to manage that manage that area and manage basically the cleanup of the refusals that are in that bunk. Okay, 3 points I want to make and talk about things that we can do from a practical standpoint. Number one, ensure cows are stimulated to go to the bunk. And I'll come back to this from a robotic scenario in a few moments as well, why this is so important for us. Number two, make sure cows have access to the ration formulated for them throughout the day. And so what I mean by that is that any time a cow goes to feed, there should be feed there for her. She's not only stimulated, there should be feed there for her, and that feed, again, going back to this whole thing, is the same as what we originally intended her to receive. So it's not sorted through, it's not picked through, it's the same stuff, it's the same quality, whether or not she gets up at 5 o'clock or she goes at 12 noon or 5 in the afternoon, that feed quality is consistent across the day. And then last point there is minimize competition for feed access, and we're gonna walk through these things. So first and foremost, how do we stimulate cows to go to the bunk? So what stimulates a cow to eat? Push feed up. What else? Fresh feed. Good feed. Water intake. Okay, good. Good ideas. Traditionally, what have we always thought of? When do cows eat? What's that? After they're milked. What about time of day? What about our grazing guys here? Morning? Afternoon? So when I went to school, I learned about the feeding patterns of ruminants. When I had a ruminant nutrition class, one of the first things that I was taught was that a ruminant has what they call a crepuscular eating pattern, which means that they have their biggest and largest grazing bouts in the morning and again in the late afternoon, basically following sunrise and sunset. And that's really the pattern that we actually see when we look at cows that are kept on pasture. You look at beef animals that are outside, you look at other ruminants that are outside grazing, you see that kind of very distinct diurnal feeding pattern where the animals have their largest, biggest meals here in the morning. And this is an example of some dairy cows that are kept on pasture. And again, they're milked here in the afternoon in this case, and then they have bigger, longer grazing bouts again later in the afternoon. And this is what we'd expect, again, when we have animals outside grazing. When I was a grad student, I was interested in this, and I got thinking about when I was watching cows all the time, particularly cows kept in a barn fed at TMR, I noticed that a number of the things that we did actually kind of aligned with this diurnal pattern. And it goes back to, I think Bob asked the question, why do we feed calves twice a day, right? Because it aligns with milking in the morning and afternoon. And one of the things that I looked at when I was a grad student thinking about feeding management of cows, I noticed that, yeah, cows were doing most of their eating in the morning and the afternoon, but again, it lined up with things like milking in the morning and afternoon, or early morning, later afternoon, and same with feeding. We're often feeding around those time periods as well. And so when we started looking at this data, we started to notice that we saw similar type patterns of eating behavior. And so one of the things that we looked at is, well, what is going on here during the day? And as I just described to you, in this case, when you see these peaks in activity, when you got, again, in this case, multiple days of data and cows all averaged together, you see these this diurnal pattern, so almost a similar pattern to those cows that are kept on pasture. But in this case here, we've got cows basically coming back from milking in both these cases. These boxes represent basically the time period right after milking and right after feed delivery in both these circumstances. And so my hypothesis when I looked at this originally was that for these cows kept inside, just based on looking at their behavior, watching them, that the time of day seemed to be kind of irrelevant to me. And it was actually more of those management factors which were having an influence. So one of the first things that we did is we actually separated those two events out from each other. So we moved the time of milking, the time of feeding away from the time of milking, just to see if we could elicit a different feeding behavior response in these animals. So we took the time of feeding from the morning and afternoon, and we moved it to the middle of the day and the middle of the night, times of the day when we don't expect to see a lot of eating behavior in dairy cows. And what we saw in that case was we saw a complete shift in terms of the feeding pattern of those cows. So in the blue line here, you now see that these cows actually had almost a larger response in the middle of the day and the middle of the night, where they're having their largest, biggest meals around that time period and less large meals around the time of milking. Yeah, they're still getting up around the time of milking to eat, but the response is much larger to that delivery of fresh feed in that case in the middle of the day and the middle of the night. And what that tells me is, again, for a cow kept inside, fed a TMR, the primary stimulus for that animal to eat in this scenario is that delivery of the feed for that animal. And that's what was really driving that. And we've seen that in other studies. There's been some work done in Canada looking at, say, for cows fed once a day, shifting the time of feed delivery from the morning to the nighttime. And what you see is basically, instead of a one peak in the morning, you see this peak basically get shifted right to the nighttime. And you actually see them almost saving up their energy, the cows eating less during the daytime and saving up their energy and having one huge big meal at nighttime. And so another practical thing, I didn't throw this in here. People ask me, summertime, is it better off than that I feed at nighttime? The challenge with that is if you do that, especially if we're feeding once a day, we push that feeding to the nighttime. Cows don't want to eat during the day, so they basically don't do a lot of eating activity. Then they get to the nighttime. And in one study by some Canadian colleagues, they actually showed that these cows, in their first meal after delivery at night, they would eat 40% of their dry matter intake in one big meal, just because they didn't feel like eating in the hot of the day. The feed that had been sitting there, basically at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, had been sitting there for 18 hours or so, getting hot and going off. And by the time they get their new feed, they're so motivated and so hungry, then they attack it vigorously and have this huge meal, which is, again, is not desirable for those animals. So we need to think about those kind of things when we think about shifting some of these management events and the impact that these things have on cows. I guess take home from this, and I'll come back to this because we've demonstrated this in another study where we've shifted feeding time away from, in the case, milking time in terms of more conventionally milked cows, is trying to create more stimulation points across the day in terms of getting cows up. So in this case here, we know feed delivery is a stimulation for cows to get up and feeding. And it's actually that delivery of feed. One of the questions I often get with this study is, was it the fact that you're feeding the cows, or is it just the fact that we, or in any case of these studies, just starting up a tractor or making a noise in the barn which actually can stimulate cows and get them up? And what was really neat, and it was really telling in this study, so the first couple days when I shifted these feeding patterns, I had groups of cows, so 12 cows in a pen, and they were side by side. And the first couple days when we started this difference in treatments, I got to the barn at 12:30 at night, and I started the tractor. And this is a research barn in B.C. where they have a whole, like 280 stalls, all cows distributed in groups of 12 or 24 or 48. And the first night, I think I started the tractor. What do you think happened in the barn? Yeah, basically the whole barn went poof, right? All the cows get up, and they're all like, what's going on? We're getting feed kind of thing, right? It took about 3 days for that to diminish. After 3 days, the cows had it figured out. Basically, the cows knew that it was their time to be feeding and only reacted. So yeah, click it here. So you can see here the cows on the left, these are the cows not getting fresh feed. This is at 11:30 at night. Here comes the mixer wagon, dumping new feed here, and you can see these cows here. I think one more is going to get up and go to the bunk here in a second. But basically, they got up. They knew that that feed was coming at the time. Cows can figure it out pretty quick. You give them a few days to adjust. It's that consistency again, right? Cows learn these things pretty quickly. In this case, these cows figured out really quickly. That was their time to get feed. There was a couple cows feeding there. No one else in that group really responded. I went, if I was able to gain access, I would have showed you a longer clip here. I don't have access to that data anymore, but I probably would come up here and actually push this feed up. In that case, you might see one extra cow get up in that case and go to the bunk, but not that same response as you see here with all these cows jumping up and getting to that feed bunk at that time. So I think it's important, thinking about that, thinking about what driver or stimulating effect that has on cows, is the idea that cows should have access to freshly delivered feed. And knowing that that's important for a cow. There's something about that newly mixed TMR, particularly high TMR that contains a lot of silage in it. There's something really attractive of that to cows and something that they really want. So, yeah. So we know fresh feed's attractive. Is this too much fresh feed? It won't be fresh for long. So what's the problem? It's going to go off. What else is going to happen? It's going to heat. It's going to spoil. Secondary fermentation is going to start to happen. You're going to get mold growth, mycotoxins. What else?
That farmer had to go to Las Vegas.
Yeah, yeah. How many bunks look like this at home this week? It's funny though, like what Nico says though, I'm always amazed still at how many farms that I go to, not as bad with lactating cows, but even dry cows often where, yeah, we feed every 2-3 days, right? Or sometimes we'll double up the feed for the weekend because we're short-staffed, so we can't, right? Do these things matter? Yes, they do, right? We're lying to ourselves if we think that we can take these shortcuts sometimes and think that they're not going to have any impacts on our cows. In this case here, I don't know why this happened, but that feed's going to heat, it's going to spoil. What's the first thing those cows are going to do that pile? They're going to sort it, they're going to eat like crazy because can you imagine if they're feeding every 2 or 3 days, what the stuff that was left there just before they deliver this looked like, right? Not going to be very attractive. Those cows wouldn't be that desired to eat that feed in that scenario. So they're going to attack this pile, they're going to eat big meals, and it's going to have an impact on those cows. And so when we look at the delivery of feed and we look at how often we deliver feed to cows, it definitely has an impact on how the cows change their intake patterns. And actually, this is something I kind of experimentally still want to model. I've only seen this in a kind of a field situation where we see people feeding every couple days. And again, think about those situations, the impact that it might have on those behavioral patterns. But even within a day, even if we're feeding daily, we know that the frequency by which we drop feed in front of cows is going to have an impact on their intake patterns. And so again, this is some older data of ours where we simply looked at feeding frequency and how it changes. Again, this is delivery of TMR to parlor milk herds. But again, looking at how it changes the distribution of intake across the day and when cows are feeding. And so again, with a single feed delivery in the morning here, you get the single big peak in activity and then less activity for the rest of the day, a little bit of more activity surrounding milking in the afternoon, but not to the same degree. In this case, we added a second feed delivery at that second time of milking in this case, and we see 2 peaks in activity. So we see kind of a more even distribution of eating across the day. So cows not only having one big meal here, now they're having another big meal there, and other meals across the day. And then just for fun, we added in 2 more feed deliveries in this case, just to see what impact that would have on those cows. And what you see now, when we added in 2 more feed deliveries, you see those cows even more distributing their intake across the day. So now here we have peaks occurring again in the middle of the day and the middle of the night, times of the day again when we don't expect cows to be doing a lot of feeding activity. And so what we saw kind of in summary with this is that cows ended up, by changing the frequency of feed delivery, by getting feed more often in front of these cows, we saw cows spending more time at the feed bunk across the day, so stretching out the amount of time that they were spending eating. So a good thing again. Having smaller, more frequent meals through the day. Again, a good thing. And then lastly, and I think this is really important, is that we saw more equal access to that fresh feed for all cows. And so what I mean by that is we actually looked at which cows were getting to the bunk at certain times of the day. So we classified cows based on how much they competed for access to feed, so basically dominant cows versus subordinate cows, and we found that those subordinate cows were the ones that really had the greatest gains in this scenario, where those were the cows that were getting access or getting greater access to fresh feed when we started delivering feed more often.
Trevor, here is a question.
Yep.
Trevor, when you looked at that last slide, the first thing that I was wondering then is, I saw a larger dry matter intake, or I interpret a larger dry matter intake on that last slide when you fed more often. So were those the subordinate cows that actually increased the dry matter intake?
Okay, I'll answer that question. Well, I'll answer part of it now, and I'll come to a sec. So good question. Actually, in that study, we couldn't monitor individual intakes on individual cows because they were group fed. So we couldn't see any individual differences. We could only look at the feeding behavior of those cows. So when they were eating and those kind of things. At a group level in that case, we didn't see any difference in intake. And I'm going to come back to that and give me 2 slides to get back to that, to answer that question, because that's one that burns in a lot of people's minds often. The only other point I want to make on this one is that we also saw less feed sorting. And this is a consistent one. We've seen this in cow level studies. We've seen this in herd level studies. When we've surveyed herds in Canada feeding TMR, we see that basically as we feed more often, we see less feed sorting. Field study done in Minnesota showed the same thing. Herds feeding once, twice, 3 times a day. We basically see a kind of a linear reduction in sorting as we feed more often. And again, it's kind of physics, right? You got a smaller pile and you're replenishing that. It's harder for the cow. You got one single pile of feed for cows across the day. They're going to have an easier time sorting that across a longer time period. And so what we see in this case, and that's what I want people to kind of think about or cue in on, is the impact that these things have, going back to kind of that theory stuff I was talking about at the beginning, the impact that this stuff has on consistency in terms of what cows are consuming and when cows are consuming their feed. And so what this does, or when we get feed more often in front of cows, is it goes back to these things I was saying. It's stimulating cows to eat, and when they actually go to eat, they've got access to the feed that's consistent or the stuff that's been originally formulated for them. And so when we look at, going back to the question here of intake, going back to production and the impacts that this has on a cow, what we see is that a lot of the responses that we see associated with getting feed more often in front of cows have to do with basically improvements in the efficiency of the digestion of the cow. And so I'm just throwing up a few examples here, but we've got oodles and oodles of studies over the years that people have looked at different deliveries or frequencies of feed deliveries to dairy cows, whether that's feed components, whether that's TMR. And really, the most consistent things that we see are things associated with the consistency of the rumen environment. So number 1 is actually milk, fat, and yield. And it kind of goes back to some of the things we were talking about earlier. More consistent rumen, less chance of subacute ruminal acidosis, and a less chance of milk fat depression in those cows. There was a review done in 1984 by a researcher named Gibson, who at the time reviewed like 30 studies. Already in 1984, we had 30 published studies looking at feeding frequency of cows. And most of that work was component feeding. And basically the take home of that study at that time already, so 30 years ago, was that those studies where they saw basically benefits to the cows, most of that benefit was in terms of greater milk fat and yield in those cows. I just threw up a couple examples of recent studies. This was a study done from Penn State where they compared once a day versus 4 times a day. So a researcher there, Kevin Harvateen's looking at circadian rhythms in milk production, and particularly milk fat production in cows. And one of their studies, they fed cows once a day and 4 times a day. And they saw anywhere from a 0.22 to a 0.4 increase in milk fat percentage going simply by changing feeding frequency from once to 4 times a day. Similar, some work out of University of Alberta in Canada. This is an abstract, actually we're waiting to see the paper hopefully soon, where they compared once, twice, and 3 times a day feed delivery. And there again, they saw the difference between the once and 3 times a day feed delivery was a milk fat percentage of about 0.2, 0.25 or something like that. So again, significant improvement there. Other studies have shown improvements in the efficiency of production. So where we actually see more milk with less feed when we feed more often. Again, it's not the expected response all the time, but I've heard producers say that. They say, yeah, we fed more often and we actually lost dry matter intake on the herd. Or we actually had more refusals. And I said, well, did you lose milk? And they said, no. And so when you start to think about that, you think, okay, well, why might that be the case? And I know in this case, particularly this study here, they had a group of cows that were overeating relative to what they needed from a production standpoint. And so, again, I wouldn't expect that to be something desirable to see, but there are situations where we've got cows that are really not efficiently eating and not efficiently converting their feed into milk. And so this is another opportunity where we can actually get more value out of feed by having it digested better simply by changing the way the cows are eating and getting more full value out of that. And then going back to the question, intake levels, this is something that we have less consistent responses on. So sometimes, like I said, sometimes we've even seen intakes drop a little bit when we feed more often. We have one study where we showed dry matter intake go up. That was a study that we did a few years ago, again, where we're individually feeding cows. I'd like to be able to answer your question whether or not it's kind of the subordinate ones. In this case, the cows were being fed individually. They were in a group, but they had their own feeding spot. So they weren't actually actively competing for their feed access. So we couldn't tell whether or not the so-called subordinate ones would be getting the greatest gains. But I wanted to show you that data because I think it's an interesting one. And it has some ties in. Again, these are cows that were fed once, twice, or 3 times a day, and they were milked 3 times a day on a fixed schedule. But I want you to think about it from a robotic feeding scenario and milking scenario in a second. But one of the things that we saw, so we had these cows and we fed them once, twice, or 3 times, so basically at each of these peaks, and each of these peaks represents a milking time of those cows. We saw a little bit of greater intake with feeding more often. That's good, right? What's the problem with this response that we're seeing in this case from a feeding behavior standpoint? What are we actually doing? Well, yeah, we're still getting the cows to have their major big meals right at that milking time. And again, that's not a bad thing. But all we've done in this case is rather than cows having one really large meal and then smaller meals for the day, we've suddenly created 3 bigger meals across the day, rather than actually creating more stimulation points for those cows to eat across the day. And we know that cows are going to eat after milking. Again, if the feed's really old, yeah, they might not be as motivated. But cows are going to have a meal after milking. So one of the things that we can think about is actually moving things like the time of feed delivery away from milking time to actually create more stimulation points across the day. And again, this becomes important for us when we think about robotic scenarios as well. We know that cows aren't milking consistently across the day. And so we need to think about how do we get cows up, how do we get them moving across the day, and by creating more management events across the day, we can do that. So I just wanted to show you, because we actually did this in a recent study. Again, these are cows that were milked at fixed frequencies, so again, it's not totally applicable for robotic scenarios, but in this case, we milked the cows at each of these arrows 3 times a day, but we've either fed them at milking, so here's the gray line, so we fed them at 2 milkings, so twice a day feeding here in the morning, or sorry, afternoon. So our day actually started at noon or shortly after for these cows. So when they're fed at milking, they have a big meal there. This is dry matter intake per hour in this case. And then we fed them again the next morning here in that case. And so what you see is that when you couple, again, going back to this earlier stuff, when you couple feed delivery with milking, they have a big meal. Not too surprising. When we move feed delivery away from milking, in this case the blue line here, we pushed it ahead by 3.5 hours. So here in the late afternoon, and again here in the kind of mid to late morning. And what you see here is that suddenly, after milking, they don't have as big of a meal, right? When do they have their biggest meal? It's after feed delivery. It's not after milking. It's not after a certain time period of the day, right? They're having their biggest meal when they get that new feed there in this case. But rather than combining those 2 factors in this case, suddenly we've basically spread that out. We've created more stimulation points across the day for these cows. And in this case, what we saw is we saw more meals in those cows. We saw them slow down their rate of intake across the day. And from a production standpoint, which was really cool, is that we actually saw, similar to what I was talking about before, we actually saw an improvement in feed efficiency in these cows. So we actually got more kilos of milk per kilo of dry matter intake in these cows that we separated their milking from their feeding times. This is my plug, I guess, for DeLaval, but for basically for any system in terms of getting fresh feed in front of cows more often. One of the challenges that we have, and one of the questions I have is, how do we make this work? How do we operationalize this? It's very difficult on a lot of farms to think about even adding a second feed delivery of TMR per day. When they think about it from an energy standpoint, they think about it from a labor standpoint, and often it's a time thing. They just don't have enough hours of the day to make a lot of these things work. And that's where I see a lot of excitement, and the DeLaval folks can talk to you more about this in terms of things like automated feed delivery systems. Again, as I mentioned before, we're taking the inconsistency in terms of mixing out of the routine, and we're also then able to automate things like delivering that feed more often, getting the cows feed 3, 4, 5, 8 times a day, even 10 times a day, and some of the benefits that that's going to have on a cow production standpoint. Okay, someone mentioned earlier, what about feed push-up? And I basically put here, in between feedings, we want that feed pushed in and within reach. One of the questions that we often get, or I often get, is what effect does that feed push-up have actually on getting cows and stimulating them to get to the bunk? And from our research, what we've consistently showed is that basically the stimulation effect of feed push-up in terms of stimulating feeding activity is minimal to none compared to those other management events across the day. So when we compare feed push-up to milking and feeding, we see very little of a response compared to those management events that occur across the day. And we even demonstrated, this was an older study where we wanted to see if we could stimulate some more feeding activity in the middle of the night by adding some feed push-ups here, because we were only pushing up feed a couple times of the day. And what we saw in this case, we added in some feed push-ups there in the later hours of the day, or sorry, early morning hours, and we saw very little impact. We saw a little bit of a flattening of this, peak here, but really not a huge dramatic increase in terms of getting cows up into the bunk. Now, some of you will sit here in the audience and start to argue with me and say, when I push up feed, all my cows get up and they run to the bunk. I would argue that there's a problem with that scenario. What's the problem there? When you push up feed and all the cows jump up and run to the bunk, what's the problem? You've waited too long to push up feed. Exactly. If you push up feed and the cows run to the bunk, that means one thing. The cows are hungry, and now they want to eat that feed that's in front of them there. The push-up of that old feed should not stimulate those cows to get up. That feed should be there, and they should want to eat the feed that's in the bunk. So that feed should be there all the time. And so we need to think about, when we think about push-up, the reason we push up feed is not to stimulate feeding activity, is to make sure that the feed that, or when the cow does go feed, that there's feed available to her. So think about the timing of these things. Again, do we provide it quickly enough, or do we get back to that bunk quickly enough after that, say, morning feeding? Does it have to be 4 hours later, 5 hours later? Should we be back there in 2 hours, right? We know that those cows are going to push that pile forward. We know they're going to start sorting through it. Get that feed pushed back closer to them and get it in front of them. From a robotic milking standpoint, I think feed push-up is even more important. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that, again, you've got cows milling about all times of the day. Cows are going to be a little bit less cyclical in terms of their synchrony, in terms of behavior, in terms of when they're up, when they're getting to the bunk. So you're going to have more cows milling around at different time points of the day. Again, more onus for us to make sure that there's always feed available for those cows. And we actually demonstrated that in a study, actually twice now, in a couple studies, where we've done survey projects of robotic herds. And so this is a study from 2011, where we went on a small sample of robotic herds in Canada. We went on 11 farms. We went on for 1 week on these farms. We put little pedometers on the legs of the cows. We measured when the cows were standing and lying. We got all their milking data, management data, feeding data, etc. And what we found in this case was in these herds, they're pushing up feed actually only on average at that case 2.1 times per day across the farms with a range of 0 to 5.5. So herds that weren't pushing up feed, in my view, very often at all. And what we saw in that case was that when we modeled the behavior of the cows, we saw that for every extra push-up, basically across that scale of 0 to 5, 6 push-ups per day, we saw about 0.4 hours of extra lying duration per cow per extra feed push-up. And so what does that tell us? When we're pushing up, cow's eating, she's resting. If the feed's not available to her, what's she going to be doing? She's going to be waiting around, standing. She's going to be like that cow I showed you earlier, right? Standing at the bunk there, waiting for us to get that feed to her. And so by getting that feed back to these cows, making sure that that feed's there when she wants to be feeding, we're actually creating kind of a more efficient behavioral pattern in those cows. They don't have to spend time or waste time, stand waiting around for us. They can eat when they need to and then go lie down. Very similar results. We just actually completed another study last year. We went on 41 farms split between Ontario and Alberta in Canada, and we saw a very similar result. A little bit less dramatic, but we actually see, in this case, we actually see more average feed push-ups and a greater range. So in this case, across these 41 herds, we had an average of 8 push-ups per day. Very good. I think a lot more automation. A lot of these farms had automated feed pushers, so that's a good thing, ranging from anywhere from 2 to 24 times per day. And in this case, we see a little bit more modest effect. Again, probably because of that range and because we're actually pushing up feed more often already on these farms, but we're seeing about 0.1 hours per day, very small, 6 minutes for every 2 push-ups per day. So, but again, there's an effect there, a positive association there, right? Making sure that there's feed available to the cows. Cows don't have to potentially waste as much time standing around doing nothing. They can use their time at the bunk efficiently, and then they can go lie down and lie down when they want to. Another reason why push-up is important in robotic milk herds is actually in terms of making sure, again, that cows are stimulated to eat around the time of milking. And so we've long known, or we've long promoted the idea that cows need to stand for a certain period of time after they've been milked. There's never been a real good number out there as far as what that number should be. We've done a number of studies over the years with some conflicting results. What the number, in my view, should be is that cows should spend at least about 45 minutes on their feet, no less than, say, half an hour, 40 minutes on their feet after milking. Ideally, anywhere from about 45 minutes to an hour and a half on their feet after milking. And from an udder health standpoint, again, to make sure those teat gills on those cows close up well, the teat orifice closes up well before that cow eventually goes and lies down. And what you see here in this case is some data from a study that we did where we looked at robotic milk cows and how basically the difference between when cows milked, so at any time of the day, and when the feed for that cow was manipulated at some point in the day. And what I meant by feed manipulation was either a feed delivery or a feed push-up. In this case, this is one herd where they're feeding twice a day and pushing up at various frequencies at different times. So in my view, in this case, the feed push-up was actually having the greater effect because there was more of those occurring across the day. And what you see here is basically this relationship where you see more standing time after milking, so cows more inclined to stay eating after milking when their milking occurred close in time, so very close in time to the time of either a feed push-up or a feed delivery. So the benefits of feed push-up from my perspective, number one is to make sure that there's feed available in the bunk when the cows actually go there. So less so, and we can have a conversation about this, but less so in terms of stimulating cows to eat. And then number two is actually providing a more consistent product. So again, mixing up that feed and making sure that the stuff that's been pushed away gets mixed back with that stuff that's been sorted through, and you've got a more consistent product for those cows in the bunk. And again, the advent of technologies, automated pushers, I think is huge for us in terms of making sure that this stuff happens on a consistent basis. One of the challenges when I speak to producers about feed push-up, when we're doing it conventionally, whether that's by hand or with a skid steer or a tractor or something like that, is just trying to get it done on a consistent basis. There's always, even if it's an employee who that's sole job is to do that, there's always going to be some kind of inconsistency or time lapse or something that has an impact on that schedule. By using technologies like this, automating some of these things, we can again take that human error out of the equation, program it to do it when it needs to do it, and make sure that the cows have their feed when they need to. One last point on the feeding management side, and again, I've alluded to this a couple times, and I said, from my perspective, again, frequent feed delivery and push-up is very important from a robotic dairy standpoint. And again, I think it has to relate to the flow of cows and when cows are getting up and when they're milking. And probably even more so for free traffic barns, but again, it's going to have similar effects in guided traffic barns as well. But one of the things that we know is that milking times are often related to management events on a barn. And so this is data from, again, one of the studies that we did on a robotic farm a number of years back, where we just took the milkings that were occurring across the day and plotted those out. And it's really interesting. So when you look at the relative frequency of milkings per day, and you can do this on your own data, I think relatively easy, is what do you see? What does this look like? I've showed you a bunch of graphs today. What does this look like? So this is the milking pattern of these cows. Does it look like their feeding pattern? Kind of, right? And so again, you see some diurnal aspects in terms of when cows are milking across the day in this case. And so then what got me thinking here, well, what's driving that, right? And so what's driving this? And so when we look at that, we start layering things on top of here. So here, what do you think those two represent? What's that? Feed delivery, yeah. So that's our twice a day TMR delivery in this herd. And then feed push-up in this case, in this herd, was occurring about 3 times a day, and it's occurring there. So it's actually a little bit before that peak, again, stimulating this little peak here in the middle of the afternoon, and then again, they push up feed here, so with lesser activity here. So in the case of this herd here, if we wanted to try even out the milking frequency in this herd and try to get a bit more consistency across the day, potentially get that robot used a bit more efficiently, what do we got to try to do? We need to try to get more cows milking here, right? More cows milking here. And so how are we going to do that? Well, we can think about things like changing feeding management schedules. Not only feeding management, not only how often we're feeding, not only how often we're pushing up feed, but also other things that we're doing. When are we going in the barn? When are we going to fetch cows? When are we going to clean out stalls? I didn't put that in here. Very interesting. One of the factors that we found associated with milking frequency in a recent study of ours in robotic herds was simply the number of times that people were going in to clean stalls per day in their barns. And so we actually saw a difference, that people that were cleaning their stalls less frequently actually had less milkings in their herds. And this is this 41 cow study that we're currently working on the results from. And again, it could be other management factors, unmeasured stuff, but it could be the direct effect that, yeah, by getting in there at different times of the day, we're actually stimulating cows to get up and move around and
But is that because they stimulate the cows, or because they see the cow and they have the temptation to fetch the cow?
So we looked at fetching as well, and we didn't see that as a predictor in itself. Like as far as how often, we asked how often they were fetching and the number of cows and those kind of things. And that per se didn't come out as a predictor of milking frequency in those herds, but actual stall cleaning did. And I think because the propensity in those cases is if we're doing it once a day or twice a day or even 3 times a day, if we're going in there and we're getting a lot of those cows up in those scenarios, right? We're getting cows up and we're getting them flowing a bit, and that's having an impact. Whether or not too much of that can be detrimental as well is another question as well, right? But in the case of the study herds that we looked at, it didn't seem to have any negative effects, so more often was a better thing. But again, yeah, the maximum there, it's really only across kind of 1, 2, or 3 times a day. I think maybe one farmer was going in there 4 times a day or something like that. But generally, it's within that kind of small range.
Popular opinion says the opposite about tractor scraping.
Yeah, in terms of. But tractor scraping moves cows out. In theory, should move cows a lot differently than you going in and scraping up stalls.
And the problem with tractor scraping is then you accumulate a lot of manure, and then you have a lot of manure splash and so on, and this one you have also the risk of hygromastitis. So.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and you might increase the risk of dirty cows, but in that case, you're going to push them all to one side of the pen, right, or to another alley or whatever, right? Whereas when you're cleaning stalls, it's just a matter of potentially the odd cow you're getting up and down, right, and it's not having as big of an impact in terms of stirring up the cows.
What about the whole idea of actually having some time in the barn where there isn't anything going on so that the cows can kind of have like nighttime?
Very good question. Actually, that's something I have not looked at. I have not seen any good data on whether or not cows need that in a robotic scenario. I don't know if there's any experience here with anybody has that.
Well, we do the automated feeding and the pushing up, but we try to limit the amount of activity from about 11 o'clock at night to 2 o'clock.
Yeah.
So that there's really not a whole lot of moving around just to let things get quiet.
Yeah.
Cows still move through the robot, not
Yeah.
near as much, but they do kind of have a quiet time.
What's interesting is that, and I guess my question would be for you is, what's the rationale for that? If you're doing it because you think you might be promoting a bit more resting time or whatever in the cows, I would actually challenge that in that whatever study we've done, we look at feeding behavior, we also look at lying behavior of the cows, right? Because we want cows to be up at the bunk, we want them feeding frequently across the day, etc. So we've always looked at lying behavior. One of the things that we found, which is really interesting, is that I've changed how much time I've got cows to spend, an hour, hour and a half, more time at the bunk per day, having more meals, more frequent meals, all different times of the day. I have never changed the lying behavior of a dairy cow based on how often she ate or how often she was up on her feet across the day. The cow's lying behavior is really inflexible to changes in feeding management. The big factors that are going to influence lying time of cows are the stalls and the stocking density of those stalls. So the comfort of the stalls and the stocking density of those stalls. Whether or not, in your case, yeah, having a couple hours of quiet time at night is beneficial, it definitely could be. But I wouldn't worry about it from a disruption standpoint in terms of, say, disrupting that behavior.
No, and probably I'd like to add, one thing is disturbing a cow, other thing is motivating a cow.
Yeah.
Right? It's two very different things. Because if we're going to have somebody all the time fetching and bothering the cows, then we create a problem. Cows will be waiting for us. They won't be motivated. They learn how to train all of us, right? So, or we train the cows or they train us. The other thing is motivation. I think that I would do the opposite, or I would encourage to do the opposite. Because in those times where the cows are not accessing the robots, it's a good point to add a stimulation point, so that your more timid animals have access to that feed, and then you stimulate them to go and get access to the robot. Because the more you group the cows in the robot, you will have bigger batches of cows. And you have a very nice study, Trevor, that I always go back to, and is how much time do cows queue when they go to the robot? Because cows queue when they go to the robot. It's not just because you have a robot and it's a freak out traffic scenario that the cows can get into the robot. They have hierarchy. And then you will have very bossy cows that, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's 3 minutes a day that it takes for them from the time they show up to the robot to go inside the robot. And then you have timid heifers that take up to 3 hours queuing because they see the bossy cows and then you say, oh, here the boss is coming. They get out of the robot.
And they'll just stay standing there too, right? They don't,
exactly. Yeah. They used to stand in front of the robot because even if the door is open, but they have the bossy cow here. So the more you create an even pattern, and that's why all this data is so relevant, because the more you even and create different stimulation points, then the top producers said it this morning, then you create a better cow flow, cow traffic, and then you have higher milking time, lower idle time, and it's when you reach the maximum productivity. So it's creating more stimulation points throughout the entire day, but based on stimulation, not on disrupting the cows.
Did you have a point yet, Nico, or?
No.
Yeah.
Just a comment on rest in a if I ask farmers in the south of Holland, Catholic, when do you have the most milk and the most milkings? It's always on Sunday, right? So I think rest brings a lot. Yeah. It's all freak out traffic, by the way. So.
I know we got a lot of questions people want to ask here, but I think you only got a couple slides
left.
Trevor, so
we'll wrap up and see what time we have left. Okay, last thing I want to touch on, and we've already touched on this. Some people have mentioned this already. I heard this yesterday. I heard it mentioned this morning. Is the impact that feed competition has, and this is more because I think we still don't know everything we need to know from a robotic feeding standpoint. And I heard Francisco talk about it again this morning about different levels of bunk space. But I want to just get you to think a little bit about the impact that feed competition has on cows. And then we're going to take that to a robotic scenario and think about what impacts that we might have there. Just wait, Lizzie. Oh, sorry. Anyways, so you're going to see a video here. Number 8, the big girl in the middle, she's going to hit number 2 in a sec. Okay. For number 2, restart. Yeah, you can watch it again. And then we'll just leave it at that. Okay. For number 2 here, what is she going to do now? She's going to wait. What else? Lay down. What else? Stand there, wait. She's hungry.
Butt back in.
She's going to bump back in. So basically 3 things that she can do. And I would argue in that scenario, none of those are good choices for that cow. So number 1, she can stand there and wait. Again, we've already talked about this. Do we want cows just standing around waiting in barns? Not necessarily. We want her eating or lying down. If she stands there waiting, basically that's just going to eat into basically unproductive time of that cow. This is a wet floor, manure laden. It's going to be tough on her feet, increase the risk of foot problems, infectious or otherwise in that animal, increase the risk of lameness, so all bad things. Number 2, she could go lie down. She goes and lies down, and then an hour or 2 later, she gets up and she goes to the feed bunk. We haven't been back to push up the feed. So what's available to her? The stuff that's being sorted through, being pushed away, right? Unless we've, again, done a good job with feeding management and we've pushed that feed back already, right? So the feed's not going to be ideal quality for that cow. She went and lied down. In this case, this was right after milking. This is a conventional system where cows are milked. They came back from milking. They had fresh feed. In this case, she would lie down immediately after milking. Might not be best from an udder health standpoint. And then number 3 is she goes and pushes her way back in. And what happens in that scenario? What happens? They're eating in that scenario. Someone else gets pushed out. They want that feed there. What are they going to do that feed? They're going to get a big meal because they're going to eat it like crazy. They're going to eat as fast as they can because they realize that if they don't eat now, they're not going to get the stuff that they want. And basically, I could show you a bunch of studies where we've seen all of these effects. So we've done various studies where we've seen all these kind of behavioral responses of cows. One of the things I want to show you is the effect that actual space has on cows in terms of when they're at the bunk. So in this case here, we've got 8 cows here. They were all at the bunk at one time. How much space is there available for those cows between those 2 blocks? From there to there? Foot of space? 7 meters, so 21 feet. 16 feet? Counting the stalls? Good. Basically, yeah, we've got 16 feet there. We've got 4 stalls, 48-inch stalls. We've got 2 feet of bunk space per cow. Is that a lot of bunk space? Some would argue no. Some would say yes, potentially. Traditionally in the dairy industry, if we look across all farms, whether robotic or not, is 2 feet of bunk space quite a bit of space? Yeah, especially if we're in a 3-row barn. What do we typically give in a 3-row barn? 18 inches, 16 inches sometimes even, right? So not a lot of bunk space, this is considered a fair amount of bunk space. And even in that scenario, it's very difficult for us to get, in this case, all 8 of those cows squeezed into that one spot. It's kind of what Dr. Nordland was talking about yesterday about those headlocks, right? We got headlocks spaced at 2 feet. Is it easy to get 10 cows into 10 2-foot headlocks? No, it's not. We're only going to typically fill about 80% of those when cows are feeding naturally in terms of not pushing them in there or trying to lock them up. When we look at the amount of space and how it affects eating patterns, again, it's quite interesting to see the impact that it has on the eating behavior of cows. So one of the things that we've showed is that when we give them lots of space, in here we give them 81 centimeters of space, so we're looking at over 30 inches of space per cow. We're looking at, basically, we get 2 big peaks in activity. Again, these are cows that are milked twice a day, conventional milk cows, fed twice a day. So at both these feedings here around milking time, we get a lot of cows at the bunk, as we'd expect. We drop it down to 61 centimeters, so that 2 feet of bunk space per cow. And we still see very similar, a little bit lower, but not much difference. So a good thing. So still good feeding activity at those time periods. we go down to 41 centimeters. This is, we're down in that kind of 16-inch space range now. And suddenly, we see only about 50% of the cows being able to get to the bunk at those peak time periods, or 50% of the cows present at the bunk at those time periods. And then we went, in this study just for fun, we went down to 8 inches, and when we get down to 8 inches, suddenly we see that line kind of flat line.
Trevor, but what about the fact also that in robotic dairies we have all-thirds of lactations in all groups? So is even a worse effect when you reduce the feed bunk space, because then you have all those fresh cows that deserve those 30 inches of feed bunk space. And you are really stressing them out when you lower the feed bunk space, right?
So that was going to be a point. So two points I want to make from here. One is, if I want to go back to this black line, because this is one that we see particularly in a lot of our freestall dairies in North America, not as much in Canada. In the US, we see a lot. We got a lot of 3-row barns, and we're overcrowded, say, at 10, 15, 20%. We're looking at about 14, 16 inches of bunk space per cow. What do you see in this scenario that you would expect to see differently with this black line? Yeah, you'd expect this line to flatline, right? But we don't see that. Why not? Cows are a social animal, they're a herd animal, they like to do things at the same time. And so when we overcrowd freestalls, we see the same thing. Cows don't magically redistribute their lying time and say, I've only got this hours of the day to lie down, so that's when I'm going to lie down. No. They like to do things as a group. They're going to do things together. We overcrowd freestalls. We see cows lying down less. We overcrowd the feed bunk, and we see them spend less time at the feed bunk. And they concentrate their eating time. So in this case here, they're not coming back later, or they're not spreading out that eating time. In this case, they're going to concentrate their intake in this time period here. For our mid-lactation, later lactation cows, they're pretty resilient. What they'll do is they'll just eat faster. They'll do all those things that are bad from a rumen health standpoint that we've talked about, and I'll show you some data to support that. And then, yeah, we've got your fresh cows. What's going to happen to those cows in that scenario? Those cows are going to start to elect not to eat. And Dr. Nordland talked about this yesterday, saying we know that those are our most vulnerable cows, those close-up cows, those fresh cows. We need to get 30 inches of space for those cows so that there is a defined spot for them at the bunk, so that when they want to eat, they can actually go there and maximize their intake. Because those cows, if they're stressed, if they're timid, they're not going to elect to stay at the bunk and eat there and be aggressive at the bunk under that scenario. So again, in a conventional system, we've actually had a hard time showing production effects actually of reducing stocking density because a lot of times our mid and late lactation cows actually are pretty resilient in terms of making sure they get enough dry matter into them. And so seeing modeling losses in production haven't been that consistent. One of the things that we saw, which was kind of interesting, was in a study that we did, this study I've showed you a couple times already today, when we looked at herds in Canada, again, these are parlor milk freestall herds, with just under that 2 feet of bunk space per cow, with anywhere from just over a foot to almost 3 feet of bunk space per cow, so little space to lots of space. What we saw across that spectrum of farms was that every 10 centimeters or 4 inches of extra bunk space was actually associated with changes in milk components. So not intake, not total production, but actually related to the milk components. Again, milk fat, probably related to the eating patterns of these cows, getting cows to eat more consistently, getting them to eat in a healthier manner. Somatic cell count, again, could be stress, could be the fact that we're promoting cows to lie down quicker after milking if they don't have, say, sufficient bunk space in that scenario. From a robotic scenario, this is where it gets tricky because we don't actually have a lot of good data and a lot of good studies to really show us what we're seeing in the field. One study that we did 4 years ago, 3-4 years ago, we actually saw, very interestingly, a positive association between bunk space and milk production in these herds. And so in our study from 4 years ago, small sample size again, this was 13 herds, mostly all free traffic herds. Mean amount of bunk space was about 0.7, so lots of space per cow. But again, some herds with very little, and then some herds with quite a bit. Again, on the same spectrum here, every 10 centimeters or 4-inch increase across that range that we observed on those herds, we actually saw greater milk yield And similar to what we saw with the feed push-up, actually greater lying duration. So again, cows using their time potentially more efficiently when we got feed or when we had lots of feed access. And again, these are herds that were primarily feeding TMR once a day. There was a couple feeding twice and 3 times a day. But again, I think that's part of it here. Free traffic, feeding once a day. You still have a large amount of herding kind of behavior going on. Cows getting up to the bunk at once, and we see that positive association. Fast forward a couple years, we've done this other study now with 41 herds. What we found, again, these are herds in Ontario and in Alberta, Canada, we're working on right now. Again, similar levels of bunk space. So we're still seeing, again, on average, still a fair amount of bunk space available in the field there. Again, over 2 feet, but again, some range, some range there. In this case, more herds, 41 herds. We actually have a lot more variety in terms of about I was going to say actually probably 3/4 were free cow traffic and a quarter were guided traffic scenarios. Probably not enough variability though within those to actually pick out any interaction between the bunk space and the cow flow system. But at the end of the day, we really saw no association across these herds with milking activity, yield, or behavior of the cows in association with the bunk space. So where that leaves me is thinking, okay, we saw the impact before. Maybe that was quite unique to those herds. Now we're not seeing that. Getting me to think about, well, what are or where are the scenarios where bunk space might be an issue in our robotic herds? And the question I ask or I pose is, and it's kind of my final thought today, is where can we get away or where does bunk space have the potentially greatest effect in terms of our robotic milking barns? And what I put here is that can we get away with less space? Because that's something, again, I know it was talked about, like with this idea that we could build barns with less bunk space. There's no scientific evidence, there's no study that says that we can get away with less space. If anything, the only study that's really out there that showed is actually positive benefits of more space in these barns. But I put there situations where space may be more manageable, and I think this is where it comes down to it. Management trumps everything, and I think that's something we've heard about in the last couple of days. We know that. We heard that yesterday from producers. Management trumps everything. And there are situations where maybe we can get away with less space and be able to manage it better. And just a few things that I threw out there, for example. So again, high frequency of feed delivery, automated feeding systems. If we're getting feed more often in front of cows, is that potentially taking less pressure off kind of those surges at the bunk? I've seen some robotic barns where they're feeding 8 times a day, and the producers tell me that, yeah, the cows in that scenario, you don't see all the cows getting up at once. You see the cows choosing which kind of feed delivery they want to go to, so you don't see the whole herd get up. And in that case, this was actually a farm in Holland. It was one of Nico's colleagues that took me to a number of years ago. And what the producer told us in that case in that farm was that when they actually tried to cut back on the terms of the number of feedings, that's when they saw they were feeding 8 times a day, and I think they cut back to 3 or 4. And suddenly in that scenario, they just saw all the cows then getting up and jamming up the feed bunk under that scenario. And so that becomes more problematic again. And so at a high frequency of feed delivery, we can maybe get away with a little bit less space. Guided traffic barns, again, milk first type situations. Right? You might get a little bit less pressure on the bunk in that case, where we potentially can get away with less space. And then I think Francisco mentioned as well, if we've got a very consistent product in the bunk and it's not something that cows are dying to get to every time we mix up a new batch, right? If we're feeding grain in the robot and we've got grain feeders and the only thing that we're providing in the bunk is a forage, particularly if it's a dry forage or a drier forage. I've seen some farmers put just baleage in their bunks or whatever. In those cases, you don't see a lot of surges in terms of activity, in terms of the cows at the bunk across the day. And so in those cases, yeah, you might have a bit more consistent flow to the bunk, less surges and less or more opportunity to get away with a little bit less space. So that's kind of my take home on that. I don't know if there's anybody has any thoughts or wants any discussion points on this.
Yeah.
been taking the, at DeLaval, we've been taking the approach of more is better, right? Yeah. And we've been pretty successful with some of those barns. But, as a consumer, they need to know this answer. So we need more research on this answer. We really do.
No, and I agree. And that's something that, from a practical standpoint, it's very difficult. Unless we're doing studies like the ones we're involved in where we're serving herds, it's very difficult to modulate these things in a farm, right? Because we're dealing with one group of cows that becomes your kind of experimental unit in a lot of cases. It becomes very difficult to do good science on robotic barns in that scenario and actually get meaningful kind of results.
We have also advised to go for 30 inches of feed bunk space. And there are different reasons. First, we consider it's gold standard. Then is when you have the maximum potential of fresh cows to really perform to the max. But the other thing is you also grow, and that's a reality. And the robots they get faster, and it's very easy to get over 61, 62, 63 cows. Then we start overstocking those barns. And even we plan for perfection, but life is not perfect. And you will always put more cows, and you will have moments where you have more cows calving. So better always to leave some room and flexibility, not sacrificing the fresh cows, which should be our priority.
Yeah.
Trevor, you showed us that video where one cow got pushed out of the bunk at that time. How often does that happen in a day for an individual cow and a heifer?
Good question. Yeah, and I normally ask that question when I show the video. So for that cow that got pushed out, so the average cow, so under that circumstance, when we've measured this, when we've looked at this, you've got 2 feet of space per cow, you're looking at competition, the average cow will get pushed out of the bunk about 10 times per day. For that cow there, that number 2 there, that smaller heifer, in that case, she's probably getting pushed out about 30 times a day, right? Some cows it's 0 or once a day, right? Or more dominant cows, boss cows, but some of those cows it's 30 times a day that they're getting kicked out. On average, we're looking at about 10 times per day at that level of bunk space. If we go up from 24 to 30 inches of bunk space, we reduce that by half, actually. And then we go into scenarios where we're using headlocks, particularly again, like what Dr. Nordlund was talking about, we go with a wider headlock, we go with a 30-inch headlock, or we've even tried studies where we put these individual dividers between cows. We can almost virtually eliminate that displacement behavior in those cases. But again, my take home again in any situation is start with your most vulnerable cows. And for a conventional farm, parlor milk farm, it's those close-up and fresh cows. It becomes a bit more difficult when we're suddenly those fresh cows are now in a pen of all different milking cows in a robotic scenario, right? And so that's another reason I think what we need to kind of going off what Francisco said is that we need to be kind of building our facilities to protect those most vulnerable animals. And in this case, I think that's one area too that we need to key in on is those early lactation fresh cows that are potentially most influenced in those circumstances.
Yep. We have the Optimat system, and so we do frequent feeding. My question is, if we're going to really optimize the system, is there still the potential that if, like at 16 feedings, if there was a potential of clustering a few feedings on, say, with the day patterns with?
So the question is, with an Optimat automated feed delivery system, if we're going to like a lot of feedings per day, you're saying 16 or, yeah. Whether or not there's opportunity to cluster those at certain time periods of the day. I guess my gut feeling in that case, if you're feeding that often, that you're just going to do it every, whatever that works out to be, hour and a half of the day, right?
Because you can't quite do it exactly like that because you have to have a battery time to you have to have time to recharge and that. So you're still going to have about 3 hours that you can't do it.
Okay.
So it's not going to be exactly every so often.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure as far as advice goes, just because I haven't had enough experience working with that high of a delivery frequency. I would say if we're in that kind of 6 to 8 times a day, then we do it on as much of a consistent interval pattern. So a 6 and an 8 hour, a 3 and 4 hour interval, right? So we're going every 3 or 4 hours across the day. If we're at that often and you're constrained, again, by the machine not being able to run for so many hours, yeah, you could cluster them a few together. Again, I would probably look at, my approach would be to actually look at your milking frequencies across the day and actually look at where you might have some opportunities to get cows up and moving. Like if we do have dead times in the robot at certain time periods of the day, particularly in the middle of the day, start with that, right? And then work off that.
I got a question. Do you find headlocks to keep from pushing cows out better than just a neck rail? I noticed in the barn before that we'd have a cow, boss cow would run the rail, she would just keep pushing down the line. Do you have a study that shows that will headlocks prevent some of this and sorting?
Yeah, so the question is, yeah, do headlocks actually prevent cows from pushing other cows out and moving down the bunk? And definitely so. Even a traditionally 24-inch headlock, we've done studies looking at those and looking at the impact that it has on competition. We see, again, about a probably 30 to 40% reduction in the amount of competition you see at the bunk when you see that. So cows would be more prone to stay in one spot in that case. As far as the level of sorting goes, yeah, we didn't see that in those studies, and I wouldn't be convinced that we would see less sorting in that case, because cows can still be just as effective sorting in one spot, right? Because sorting, particularly at a group level, it's mass action, right? Because it's every cow in every spot, right? So even if that one cow moves down and sorts, right, as she goes along, then someone else is going the other way, and it's going to even out kind of at the end. So.
And for her question, we also have the Optimat, and we're feeding 15 times a day. We're batching 5 times a day, and then out of those batches, we're delivering three times an hour apart. You know, and we've been on that for a little over 2 years now. Yeah. You know, find out like her, trying to see. I just did the math. We're about 14 inches of bunk space for a cow, is where we're at. You know, been fairly successful. You know, noticing cows at the bunk pretty well around the clock. You know, we do our last feeding at 1:30 in the morning. Then we're going to start batching again at 3:30, whatever the next delivery to start at. 4:45 when we come in to start work the barn. But we are doing, you know, quite a few feedings throughout the day, always delivering fresh feed.
Yeah, yeah, and that's exactly my point here. I think that's where we can potentially utilize or take full advantage of particular situations, yeah, where we have less space. We need to be getting feed that often in front of those cows to get the cows to distribute their intake across the day. Because if you didn't, if you're only dropping feed once a day, then you'd end up with problems at the bunk in your barn, right?
Speaking of bunk space, lunch is coming up here pretty soon, and it might get a little crowded at the buffet. But we got time for one more question here from Marcus.
Yeah, it wasn't really a question, more just of how we do it in Australia to break up the 24-hour thing, like you were asking. That, you know, Alvin would know as well. When you got 400 or 500 cows wanting to come to the dairy at sunrise and sunset, you just can't handle that. So we've obviously just it's all got to do with, you talk about pushing feed up, we're just opening new areas of the farm up. And over the 5 years we've been doing it, nearly everyone that starts VMS in Australia now just jump on these set times of 2 in the morning. So you have a third of the herd roughly move at 2 in the morning probably. Then by sunrise the rest will want to move. And then at 8, 9 in the morning the next break will open. And then again later in the day the sun's setting and then the next break opens. So you just to get, and the difference is about, it's probably you're milking 140 milkings a day or 180 milkings a day. If you can milk from 2 to 6 in the morning, that's the difference. And so you have to be able to do it to get your VMSs working.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that fits kind of with our concepts for in-barn feeding and right, that the more kind of stimulation, more events across the day, we can get more efficient use out of our robots as well.
Yeah, and you guys just be careful at the buffet over there because Dean's like that number 8 cow, you know, so yeah, you don't get butted out of the way. So, but thank you, Trevor.
Thank you.